Welcome to Disambiguation. I'm your host, Michael Fawcett. Each week we interview experts in AI, generative AI, and business automation to help business leaders understand how to use these tools for the biggest business impact. We're off this week, so in lieu of our regular episode, we're going to bring you a best of episode from last year from season 1, and that's AI governance, compliance, and regulation with Jacob Beswick, Director of AI Governance Solutions at Dataiku. Hope you enjoy that. In our show today, we look at AI governance, compliance, and regulations. I'm joined by Jacob Beswick, Director of AI Governance Solutions from Dataiku. Jacob, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Could you give us just a brief intro and then a little bit about yourself, your role at Dataiku?
Sure. So as you introduced me, I'm the Director for AI Governance Solutions. What that means is that I lead a team who works closely with our customers on helping them to articulate what good AI governance looks like for them, then ultimately helping them to push that practice into the product, which I'm happy to talk a little bit more about in time.
Yeah.
In terms of like my background, why I'm in this space, so I originally started in the UK government, where I was in the Office for Artificial Intelligence, and I was responsible for a few things, including AI governance and regulation at the UK level. That exposed me to the EU and the developments there, which is like the thing I think a lot about today. And it's kind of pushed me forward in this direction.
Oh, that's great. It is. It's a topic that comes up a lot in conversations, and certainly ethical use, responsible use. So beyond just the regulation, but actually, how do I ensure internally that I am compliant, that I do have governance in place? So why don't we start there? So how does AI governance make it so that companies feel comfortable with ethical and responsible use of AI?
It's a good question. I'm going to be sort of pseudo-academic initially, which is to say AI governance onto itself doesn't ensure those things, right? So AI governance can be driven by organizational priorities that can speak to things like driving value, operational efficiency, things that are completely detached from ethical considerations or responsible AI considerations. But when an organization makes a decision to focus on ethical AI, responsible AI at the development and use stages, or even including procurement, it's really about the organization articulating the values that are associated with ethicality or responsible AI. So things like reliability, robustness, transparency, fairness, et cetera, the things you see quite commonly in the very public spaces of the OECD, different kind of governments, and figuring out the sequence of actions that help to prove or supports proof of those principles being met. So it requires the commitment from leadership on the one hand to say, we're committing to this ethical orientation, and then down the chain, figuring out what's the course of action we need to execute to ensure that we're systematically doing this. But importantly, when it comes to governance, documenting and providing auditable content that you're doing it.
I mean, so it seems like a big part of that then is that intentional intentionality to actually approach it this way. I want to be ethical with the use. I want to, deal with bias if I can. I want to be responsible. Okay. I mean, that makes sense. And I think that some of that is kind of like we used to talk about customer experience. It's not technology first. It's actually a strategy. You have to sit down and figure out a strategy. And it seems like that's what you're saying here too. So
that I would advocate that because if you kind of go slapdash, there are ramifications down the chain, I would argue. So if you're going slapdash, one team's doing it, another team's not. Somebody upwind catches, oh, this is an important thing, I then want to spread it out. Basically, if you don't have a consistent, coherent approach, you stand the opportunity, you open the opportunity to creating kind of like a patchwork, which could be fine in some instances, but it might not in others. So it does require concerted decision-making, concerted actions, and that's really important because there's a change management aspect to this. So people need to know what they have to do differently, and that needs to be kind of instilled at a management level, but from my perspective, also at a tooling level.
No, that makes sense. So you can approach it both strategically, but you can also have tools that help enable that in the platform. That makes sense. So I know regulations all over the place, and it's a complicated topic to even bring up. But I'm just curious, kind of from a high level, what do you think the challenges are in regulating AI technologies in general? And I know certainly some things are different. The EU has approached it differently. The US maybe hasn't approached it. It's complicated, I know, but I'm just curious, kind of what do you think the challenges are for that?
It's a good question, and I think about it. I've thought about it for a long time. If you have anybody kind of with my background sitting in front of you and you ask that question, the first thing that they're obliged to say is tech moves faster than regulation. And then they walk away and that's it. So I kind of thought, is it worth exploring what that means? Like, should we unpack that a little bit? So on the one hand, we understand tech evolves for various reasons. There's business reasons. There's kind of like, for lack of a better term, ego reasons. There's all kinds of reasons that are motivating the development of technologies. And then on the regulation side, there's so many layers of things that have to happen, right? So you have to have the political will to agree, oh, there's a problem here, political will to continue, and a policy level as well to figure out what's the nature of that problem or that risk. Then you have to conduct analyses. Are these risks and potential harms aligned to existing regulatory coverage? And we're seeing this play out differently in the EU and the UK. And then it goes all the way down to figuring out what's the course of action we have to take. How do we actually operationalize it in the market through regulators or other kind of public entities? And it's really a long, cumbersome process. So this idea of tech outpacing regulation, it really is true. So if you ever hear that, it's not just a glib response from a commentator, it's a material thing. So that's the obligatory response. The next one is really the one that I'm intrigued by and that I'm seeing kind of surface in particular, the latest draft of the EU AI Act is supply chains. So this idea of, okay, if you're company A and you decide you want to start using AI, your approach might be, okay, I have data, I'll clean it, I'll use it to kind of develop some models and use those models in particular use cases. And it's all really internal, right? And so regulation, as you would read it, would apply to you and you alone, right? Now, imagine you're company B and you think, well, I really want to use AI. It's part of my leadership strategy, but I need to access it outside of my company. And by that, I mean, go to a third-party provider. That third-party provider extends, as you know, from like the data set acquisition. So maybe you want to acquire data from the market. Qualities or qualifications of that data set are iffy at best. So you're bringing that in. There are potential regulatory hurdles there. Are you responsible for the quality of that data and how you use it? Or is the provider responsible in some way? I'm not even going to entertain that discussion beyond that.
Yeah.
Then there are issues. So, okay, you've got your data, you know, you want to execute a use case, you've done your research, you figured out some model providers, and you want to use something from a third party. So you go out to the market, you find somebody either who has a model that's been developed and that needs to be refined on site, or you go to the likes of OpenAI and you say, I want to use via connection a third-party LLM. In those scenarios, if you're exposed to risk, you have some catastrophic outcome in using those third-party models, where does liability, where do the kind of regulatory burdens sit? With you, the user, or with the provider? These are things that I think are really challenging to deal with, and I think that policymakers right now are agreeing, really challenging to deal with.
Yeah.
I have more, but I think we can, unless you want to move on.
No, I mean, no, I think that's really interesting. And you know, the thing is, like, you're one of the things you hit on, I think, is probably one of the biggest challenges for businesses in general. And that is, when we say this is moving quickly, like that's a huge understatement. And tech has moved exponentially, you know, forward for years. And we know that. But if you think about the length of time from when we started talking about, we didn't call it cloud, we called it application service providers when it first started, right? But if you think about that, that was what, 97, 98, 99 time frame. And to when companies were really adopting this in a full, you know, way, and that was in the 2008, 2009 time frame. So you're talking 10, 12 years or so that, you know, you could get through a lot of those objections, the security risks, the fear of, you know, letting your data outside your firewall, et cetera. And now we're talking about something that we only started talking about in a broad sense 9, 10 months ago. So I mean, from an acceleration standpoint, that has to be an amazingly difficult thing from a regulatory standpoint, but from a company standpoint. So I'm gonna turn this inside for a second, because I think
Mm,
that maybe this is a good place for us to spend a good bit of time, and that is compliance itself. So, and compliance can mean regulation, but it could also mean hitting the strategic goals that you set for yourself
mhm.
for responsible and ethical use. So I'm curious, how can frameworks be put in place to address those risks and concerns associated with AI, and also keep up to the changes that we know are happening on a weekly basis?
Yep, tall order.
Mm.
I'll start with how we actually define when I go to in front of a customer, or anybody from my team goes in front of a customer or an organization, and we start talking about AI governance. We make sure the first thing we talk about is what exactly are we talking about, and then I think that'll lend itself to answering your question, and not in a roundabout way, but perhaps in a slightly extended way. When we say AI governance, we're referring to a framework that enforces organizational priorities uh, through standardized rules, requirements, and processes that affect or shape how AI is designed, developed, and deployed. And that first step is organizational priorities, right? So those things will shift organization by organization. When it comes to ethical priorities, these can be informed by things that already exist within a company.
Mhm.
We want to be support equity. We want to support fair outcomes, whatever. These can exist AI or pre-exist AI. But then when you look to the wider market and you get this sense of there's actually a lot of commonality in terms of what the right approach is. So like this common principles for what good, ethical, responsible, trustworthy AI should look like. And these principles are effectively, I think, not to historicize, but they've been developed with the backdrop of what are the risks, right?
Mm.
So in a kind of adhering to these principles, you're kind of indirectly orienting your AI governance framework, in a way that speaks to the risks that have been perceived, articulated, et cetera. Um, I think that partially answers your question. Did I miss anything?
Well, I mean, I think that does at least start to say, because one of the things that I kind of hear in there is that you're really trying to align with how you've approached your business in general, right? This is not just a carve out. Like, I
Yep.
have diversity challenges and ethical challenges, and build that into the culture. Then we want that to extend across the use of AI and the way we govern ourselves around AI. Does that make
I,
sense?
I think I got caught up so much in the beginning of that journey, I completely forgot about the end of the journey. So, yes. So, you know what, business by business, they're not going to have the same sets of priorities, right? So you can have a
Right.
business A who thinks, well, I'm using pretty AI and pretty mundane back office applications. They're not exposing anybody to any real risk or harm.
Sure.
And then 6 months later, you're talking about adapting. I think you referred to adapting. 6 months later, that same business thinks, you know what? I like how this is working. I want to see where else I can achieve any kind of savings, efficiencies, whatever. And let's assume that they then operationalize a use case in HR. We know that HR is perceived as pretty high risk, right?
Yeah.
So we look at the EU AI Act; it's a high risk tier. It aligns to the pretty kind of like thorough set of new obligations that are oriented at that high risk tier. And then we also look at New York, where they say basically you can't use New York City, you can't use AI applications and HR functions.
Yeah.
So from that mundane use case where risks are kind of nil and you maybe thought about it and you thought, oh, this is pretty, all's cool, I don't need to really worry about it, to HR use case, what are the
Mm.
risks associated there? What are the obligations you have to applicants, to existing employees? How do you ensure that those are accommodated or respected in the use of that application? Looking to the principles I mentioned earlier, you might find some alignment. So you want to ensure that your usage of AI is fair, that it's not biased. You want to ensure that you can be transparent and about your usage and explain
Mm.
outcomes, right? So I think you're right. It's not a carve out. I think it's probably context dependent, use case dependent, where you might start
Mm.
thinking differently about when AI governance resonates. Um, yeah.
I mean, I think I've heard, because I've been to a couple of CRM, CX sort of conferences recently, and of course, everybody wants to talk about generative AI, but the but the risk, employee risk, data privacy, certainly customer data and privacy risk too, right? So that's a
Mhm.
different approach, and some of those systems are starting to build things in that can help. From a technology standpoint. So maybe that's an interesting sort of side bar around this. Like, what do you think from a technology perspective? What should companies look for when they're looking for that underlying platform or approach when it comes to helping them manage that governance and compliance?
So I almost feel like the fundamental question here is, what does good AI governance look like? And then what things do you need to build good AI governance?
Yep.
So from my perspective, good AI governance starts outside of a platform, as we've talked about already. You need
Yep.
to be able to articulate basically what's your goal state? What are you comfortable with? What do you think is the right approach for your use of AI? Fine. Let's say you've articulated through principles or some high level articulation. The next step is to figure, how do I translate that into actions? Can I translate it into actions? And there's some decision making that needs to happen here, right? So if you say that we don't want any AI we use to be biased, well, or we want all AI we use to be fair, what's the threshold that helps you make a determination that you're meeting that principle that you've set? I'm not the one who can tell you. This is something that has to be decided internally, right? Or if you're in a regulated industry, maybe it's been determined for you and you can just articulate it through a sequence of actions in-house. Now, from my perspective, there's technological kind of relevance in two ways here. I mentioned actions. So like there's a course of actions in the development side of things. So this is basically making sure that you're able to, through your tooling, in-house tooling, assuming this is a scenario where you're building internally, do the right checks on the data sets that you're going to be using to train models. It's about having the right kind of metrics and being able to examine and qualify models that you're training for a particular use case aligned to the things we were talking about. And then our bread and butter when we talk about AI governance is being able to articulate in full the sequence of decision making and codifying the right information about the process of developing a particular use case and model, such that you build this auditable content that proves that you've done everything in your power to meet your goals, right? And importantly, from my perspective, and this is one of the reasons I joined Dataiku, it's this idea of governance should like seamlessly integrate into the space of developing and deploying AI. And that seamless integration might look different for some organizations, but from my perspective, the starting point is that codification of relevant information that speaks to the things you care about, and also the ability to enforce accountability. So having people who are reviewing the process, signing off on the process, and that being functionally a gating to deployment, so that your governance speaks to any particular outcomes you're looking to achieve. So like, how can I put that differently? Your governance is effectively the catalyst for successfully deploying things that will meet your company's tolerances or thresholds or goals.
So it's built in then to the process of going live with whatever that activity use case might be, and you're testing, you're ensuring that you've documented that as you are going through that process. Then
that was a much cleaner way of saying it. Yeah.
That's what I'm supposed to do, right? So this is, I mean, I think this is really important for companies to understand. And I guess the other side of that then is what if you don't? I mean, what are the potential consequences for an inadequate process around governance and compliance?
Well, if we accept the common theory that AI governance regulation is designed to mitigate risk, right? That's the key theme. Now, if we don't enforce AI governance at all and we operate on the same theory, we just check out the inverse, which is that if you're not doing anything, you're exposing yourself to risk. What that risk looks like will depend on the use case. So if you're doing something very public, we've seen this time and again in I mean, I can't even remember going back to when, but very public mess ups, let's just call them mess ups, whoopsies, which are beyond whoopsies, where companies basically have to put their tail between their legs and, remove a lot of investment in particular products and services because of an outcome that could have been mitigated with a governance approach. We see it in the public sector. I mean, we saw it in the UK when they were using some kind of algorithm to make determinations on students' scores, test scores, right? We've seen it elsewhere in Europe. So effectively, if you're not deploying AI governance, it's like an insurance policy. You're exposing yourself to risks, and then you are, whether consciously or not, accepting the fact that you might have yourself a whoopsie.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense because I mean, and in the US, we've had some of those sorts of like, oh wow, you're doing that, like with algorithms, particularly around things like sentencing algorithms or places where there is really a clear risk of bias. And you know that the data set, it's very difficult to get a clean data set that would actually support that sort of an algorithm
Yep.
function,
I
right?
mean, the scenario you're referring to, I think they used a model that wasn't even designed for that purpose. They just repurposed it. Plus the data. Yeah, no, it was a mess.
Yeah.
That was gross I won't say that. That was that was careless.
Careless. That's a guy. Careless is a
Yeah.
good word.
Yep.
So I mean, that kind of leads me into another part of this, and we talked a little bit about it's hard to regulate, but I'm curious. You deal with this all the time, and you talk to a lot of companies. I mean, what do we want government? What should government, what role government play in this? Like, is this something that we really do need regulation around, or is there some other approach that would be better? I don't
I have a friend who I worked with in government and who we've maintained contact to this day, and he and I feel radically different about this, right? So he is like free market. Everybody
know.
should just do what they need to do. My perspective is not that. My perspective is government's, in theory, purpose is to set out kind of like approaches to various things that ensure that the public is safe. And part of that ensuring that the public is safe means exercising regulation or at least exercising expectations for what good looks like.
Mhm.
Now, if I look at the global market or the global whatever, different countries, I can think of like two extremes. On the one hand, you have Singapore, who's come out with a risk management framework in 2019, and more recently AI Verify, which is a non-statutory or not legally required set of practices that are designed to support particular principles that they've articulated and
Mhm.
reflect the reflections of what came out of the OECD. And then you have the EU, which is like intense. Like it's quite interventionist. It's really thorough. It's really detailed. It will likely have a heavy burden on certain use cases or AI systems.
Mhm.
Um, Government's role looks very different in those two scenarios. So
Yeah.
but the commonality is that both are saying this is what good should look like, and these are the things you should care about.
Mhm.
Who am I to say whether this version, the EU version, is the right way or the Singapore version is the right way?
Right.
But what I do know is that the valuable thing is governments can come forward and say, you know, theoretically speaking on behalf of the public, these are the things that are the good things,
Yeah.
right? Aspire to that.
Yeah. I mean, that is a very basic level, really resonates. And I think, if you're an executive in a business, part of the problem is knowing what good looks like. Like I'm not sure. And some of the things inside of using generative AI are a bit opaque. So that is risk, and you need to be able to understand that. And if you don't know
Yeah.
what good looks like, then how do you do? Yeah, that I mean, that to me
So,
that makes a lot of sense.
so this idea of what good looks like, we can actually unpack that, right? So I'm referring to this very high level notion of kind of like a North Star,
Mhm.
which is follow the North Star and then figure out the rest. But the rest is the complicated bit. The rest is like the actions I mentioned earlier. What do you actually do, right?
Mhm.
And this is the space that I find really interesting, and it's the one that we're kind of getting embroiled in when we talk to customers or organizations who are looking to implement AI governance. Right now, there's no right answer, and we're kind of being prescriptive in that we're proposing like a workflow-based approach to governance that's integrated into the development and use of AI. Right? It's not necessarily the case that everybody will follow that approach. They might take a really kind of like light touch approach. They
Mhm.
might rely on things like spreadsheets. It'll look different for different places for different
Sure.
reasons. But that issue of how do you make it happen? It's an interesting time to be in this space because it's kind of I was going to make a reference to like Manifest Destiny, but it's this period of like exploration and figuring out the right path.
Yeah, and it also I wonder, it strikes me as I listen to that, the different approaches, of course, are going to make it difficult for global companies because you have to comply. And I mean, honestly, privacy's already kind of been in that boat for several years, and I've worked around and had to help, figure out privacy policies at companies like G2, where I used to be an executive, and so that's a complicated one. And I'm just curious then, are there drawbacks to the way this is being implemented? Or like we say, Singapore's is more North Star here's what good looks like, and use more regulatory compliance, forcing behavior essentially.
Yep.
Is there, are there drawbacks to either approach really?
Oh goodness, this is yes. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay.
uh, Look, this is me exercising like policy side of brain, and this is experimental conversation rather than dogmatic
Yeah.
or confident
Sure.
even. So if I'm looking at Singapore and I'm thinking, here's guidance that's been provided by the government on what good looks like, but it's not obligatory, and let's just
Mhm.
accept that that's the state of play. There's no obligations, there's no punitive measures taken if you're not doing this.
Right.
Um, the drawback is that by providing that approach, organizations might think it's indicative rather than like actually functionally useful.
Right.
And then what we talked about earlier, this kind of risk exposure, this idea of, are you doing the right things to ensure that your insurance policy of AI governance is in place? It might not materialize in a way that's beneficial to companies or the public. Singapore is an interesting context because basically, I think if the government even makes a recommendation, companies will say, yes, okay, we hear you.
Yeah.
But I'll leave it at that. In the context of the EU, look, I'll talk to the state of play today, which is that we are watching trilogues happen. We are waiting for technical and political decisions to be made around what the content of the action look like. But we all know something's coming, right?
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of organizations are spurred on by the experience with GDPR to think more proactively about onboarding some of the things that they're reading in the text today. They're wanting to get ready. So getting ready at this stage is kind of complicated, right? Because nothing's real yet, but we have strong indications of the direction of travel. And so it's requiring, for those companies who are being very front-footed, investments without confidence that they're going to be the right ones or that they'll have to fine-tune, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a drawback there. In terms of a general drawback of a highly interventionist approach, some would say that being kind of rigid means that it's not allowing innovation. It's not allowing things to again, these are the things that somebody in my seat would have to say by obligation, which, may or may not be true. It's too soon to say.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance, and that this is sort of a tech fallback, right? Oh, that stifles innovation. We can't have that. But there's also that dark side risk. So I feel like we've got, and particularly in something that is growing so quickly, and is, I think I think it was a McKinsey study that said nearly 100% of companies are going to do something with AI over the next 12 months. That's crazy. And not in a bad way. It's just like, whoa. There is real risk, and it's a balance. And how do companies then think about this? How can you ensure, to some confidence level, transparency and accountability in the AI systems that you're testing and deploying now? What should you do?
So this is some of these are going to be like no duh answers, right? So the first one is, you need to know what your assets are. And so when we talk about this, when in the context of AI governance, it means having a competent and well-developed registry. So what are the things that exist across your whole kind of like ecosystem, not only in the development stage, but also in deployment? Being able to kind of wrangle that is not straightforward for some companies or some organizations. It takes a lot of work because things are hidden away. They're on somebody's laptop. They're being productionized somewhere else, blah, blah, blah. So it takes a bit of internal, I'm using this word illustratively, internal audit kind of to figure out what are my assets. Then it's a question of basically getting a sense of aligning those assets to the expectations that you've articulated for what good looks like in your company, what you basically want to make sure of is happening, and then prove that it's happening through rigorous documentation, having proof points that everything's aligned to internal policy, which is again informed perhaps by external policy. And then having abilities to articulate internally and externally when AI is being used. So this is another thing that we often see, especially in the context of generative AI right now. How do you make sure that people know it's real, what's produced by AI, what's not. But I think that extends beyond generative AI, and this is a transparency outcome, right? Or a transparency goal. If you're accessing, I don't know, finance through whatever Amazon, and Amazon's used an algorithm to make a determination about your creditworthiness, you should probably know, because again gives you the opportunity to orient your challenge if you don't like the outcome of it.
Sure.
In terms of accountability, that idea of assets, you need to know owners. You need to know what's being deployed, who's signed off on it, assuming somebody has. That idea of accountability is really about allocating responsibility and knowing basically where in your chain of the organization you can insert yourself if you have an issue or something else. These things can be chaotic to organize, and so like this is where tooling can be a useful thing. Tooling from the registry perspective is very useful. Tooling from the documentation about the development and use of different AI products is useful. So being able to qualify their kind of like risk levels, being able to explain where they're being used, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, for the purpose of like accountability, having documented information about who did what when, right?
Yeah.
Because if you look at, this is a slight detour, but if you look at something that came out of the UK a year or two ago called AI assurance, and the AI assurance theory was that you can grow trust in AI use and AI in general through AI assurance. And therefore, in so doing, you will have wider impacts on the economy because more people will be predisposed to using it, et cetera, et cetera. But AI assurance was really about outsourcing things like audit, elements of governance that could be executed by third parties. Now, if you can imagine a world where the scenario of an organization who cares about transparency and accountability later down the line, but has already deployed many things, then has to go back and hire a third-party auditor to help basically do what I've described, that's a big price tag. Yeah.
Well, and it seems like it's a bit fraught with risk there in a lot of ways because of the fact that you haven't established standards up front, so you're going to try to backfit them, which seems like even more difficult from my perspective anyway.
I would 100% agree with you.
The one thing that I heard in there that I think is interesting, and I haven't really thought about it this way, I mean, I guess it's obvious in some ways, but is that transparency really varies greatly by the use case. Who you're transparent to, what you're transparent with, is very dependent on what you're trying to do, what the outcomes are.
Yes, I agree. And look, I'm not going to claim like intellectual ownership over this. This is something that's in the heading of implied in the heading of the one of the obligations set on the UI Act. It's transparency and information to users, information provision to users. And the idea of transparency on the one hand is just say, okay, you're using AI here. But then it comes down to the world of transparency and explainability, right? So it's this idea of, you're using AI here. Now, what else do you need to know? What else can we be transparent about? It might be line level explanations for why a decision's been made in a particular way. And that won't resonate in every circumstance, but it will in some.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, I think, and some really actionable things that we've talked about today. That's really all the time we have. So, Jacob, I really want to thank you for joining me today. I know the audience will really appreciate some of the interesting discussion and advice that they can take out of this. So I think it's a really actionable and important topic that companies really need to be thinking about. And like you said, they need to think about it first, not later, because the later is much more costly and risky. Before I let you go, though, my hard question of the day, I like to ask every guest, can you recommend somebody, a thought leader, an author, a mentor maybe who's influenced your career, or you think that the audience would find interesting to investigate and learn from?
That is a really tough one for me to answer. And I think that my get out of jail free answer is, in all the jobs that I've had, what's been fascinating is that the things that I've worked on, especially in this space, are really pretty democratic, right? So it's groups of people coming together to hash things out rather than one individual here or there. So if you can withstand the laborious reads of things like, I don't know, extensive documents that reflect legislative developments or whatever, I would highly recommend looking into things like, if you haven't read the EU AI Act draft, you got to do it. You got to understand basically what's being laid out there, and know in the background that you literally had to start with groups of like they're called high-level experts coming together and like hammering out the details of what matters, right? So that to me is pretty inspiring. Similarly, if you're preoccupied with things like procurement, if you're preoccupied with things like what could principles look like at a risk management level, go to the NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology's AI Risk Management Framework. Again, it's a long read, but it's useful because it helps to kind of open your mind to ways of thinking about challenging topics that we've covered today.
Well, and could certainly inform your strategy as you're trying to think through that too. So it sounds like that would be really important to help with a basic framework that helps you understand kind of where things are going there. So yeah, that's good. Thanks. And I don't think that's a cop out at all, by the way. I think that's a very good way to point people. I mean, it's been a long time, and I certainly on my podcast have never recommended you go read regulations, but
well,
I think
it starts today.
It's first today. Yeah, that's it.
It might happen more and more depending on how the world goes.
That's absolutely the truth. Well, anyway, thanks everyone for joining today. Remember to hit that subscribe button for more on AI. If you want to check out some research, we did a survey in August and published a research report on the Arion Research site. You should check that out. It's a free download. And then join us next week. We'll have another interesting discussion around AI and business use of AI and automation. I'm Michael Fawcett, and this has been the Disambiguation Podcast.